And then it's an honor for me to introduce Professor James Robinson, a distinguished academic and recent recipient of the, it's complicated because if I talk to him, then you don't hear it correctly, but I will try to do my best.
You can't stand there.
Then, and I have to, thank you. I thank you very much. Then, I repeat, I wrote it. It's an honor to introduce Professor James Robinson, a distinguished academic and recent recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, award alongside Professors Asimov and Johnson for their pioneering research on how institutions shape prosperity. Professor Robinson, I wrote something of like 5 minutes. If they interrupt me every 10 seconds, I will take all your time. Then Professor Robinson is a leading scholar in political economy and development economics, widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of our time. Thank you for that. His work has profoundly transformed our understanding of the role of institutions and the role of institutions play in driving economic development, as well as the historical and political forces shaping nations in modern times. Currently, Professor Robinson holds the prestigious position of Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson Professor at the University of Chicago, where he also serves as the Institute Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. Bad time for that. But I wasn't. Prior to this, he held prestigious positions at Harvard University, and earlier in his career, he was an associate and assistant professor at Berkeley and a lecturer at the University of Melbourne. Among his many roles, Professor Robinson has served as an academic advisor to the World Bank World Development Report on at least two occasions, and as a board member of the Global Development Network, contributing his expertise to shaping actual global development policies. Thank you, Tom. All along his highly profile career, Professor Robinson has been recognized with numerous awards, including the 2018 Carlos Diaz Alejandro Prize from La CEA in Guayaquil, an award that yesterday in this very conference was presented to Professor Raquel Fernandez. I don't know if Raquel is somewhere there. Where it was. Then he also was awarded 2017 William Riker Prize. I'm not sure. William Riker Prize in Political Science from the University of Rochester. His pioneer book, Why Nations Fail, co-authored with Professor Asimov, has earned multiple honors and widespread recognition. He also has been awarded honorary degrees by prestigious institutions, including the Universidad de los Andes in 2017. His expertise and insight have taken him to lecture halls and institutions all around the world, the globe, including in Latin America and the Caribbean, where he gave distinguished lectures at the Central Bank of Paraguay in Asunción, and the Arthur Lewis Distinguished Lecturer at the University of West Indies in Trinidad. That's right. I'm reading your CV correctly. That's good. Last, but certainly not least, Professor Robinson had a deep and enduring connection with Latin America and the Caribbean. His extensive research on the region, particularly Colombia, has significantly shaped our understanding of how historical and institutional dynamics influence economic and political development. I was digging in your work. Then digging on his prolific work, I found a remarkable paper that is entitled Colombia, Another 100 Years of Solitude, that perhaps you remember?
Question mark.
Question mark, yeah, question mark. Sorry for my bad pronunciation. In this paper, he draws on the evocative metaphor of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, very well known by all Latin Americans, to illuminate Colombia's persistent struggles with inequality and governance, underscoring the need for transforming institutional change. I highly recommend reading this remarkable work. I like reading it. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from a scholar whose work not only advanced economics but also profoundly impact how we understand the complexity of development and inequality. Professor Robinson brings us his paper on fears and dreams, exploring into how aspirations and worries drive economic and social behavior, shedding light on the forces shaping growth and inequality in developing societies. As in Macondo, the fears of Colonel Aureliano Buendía and the dreams of José Arcadio, they symbolize the tension between fear of stagnation and dreams of progress in your paper, mirroring Colombia's struggles with institutional and historical challenges. Robin's work offers a scholarly lens to understand the region's quest for transformation. It's a privilege to welcome you, to welcome somebody who works, makes us see development not just as a statistical problem, but as in Garcia Marquez novels, a deeply human journey. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Robinson.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, okay, good, great. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction and for your generous applause. I don't know if it's possible to be able to do something serious after that introduction, but nevertheless, you know, in the spirit of a serious event, I'm going to try to do that. So I'm going to talk about some work. I'm very passionate about this research, you'll see as I get going, with some of my collaborators, María-Angélica Bautista, my colleague at the Harris School, Juan Sebastián Galán at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Rafael Torres. Rafael was a student in Bogotá. He's now my pre-doc at University of Chicago, and Ragnar Torvik, one of my long-standing Norwegian collaborators. Okay, so what's this project about? You know, I hadn't really thought about Macondo, but by the end, you'll see the connection between this research and Macondo, actually. It's really about where, you know, this project is oh gosh, I feel really kind of constrained here. Do you think I could use this? Is this going to work if I just pick it up? Yeah.
Okay.
Is that, oh yes, look at that. Okay, gush, that's much better. All right. So this is a project that is going to exploit variation across Colombian paramilitary groups to try to understand kind of non-institutional sources of kind of political strategy. So having talked about how wonderful institutions are, I thought, you know, in the spirit of sort of self-subversion, I should give a talk about, you know, how institutions don't have an R squared of 1, and maybe there's other sources of variation in the world to think about. And this research started when I was actually on sabbatical in Bogota in 2011, 2012, and just reading the newspapers, the paramilitaries, all these paramilitary groups, about 34 paramilitary blocks, about 35,000 fighters had demobilized in 2006, and they were all going through a transitional justice process. And in the newspaper, they just started telling all these stories about what happened. You know, what happened, how did they organize, what were they doing? And it was just absolutely fascinating. So we realized this was this kind of amazing natural experiment. You know, how come it took us, I started working on this with María-Angélica. Juan Sebastián was my RA before he went and did his PhD at Harvard. How come it took us 13 years to finish the project? Because all the information was in this ongoing transitional justice process, and we had to wait for the whole thing to converge and all the information to come out in tens of thousands of pages of transcripts of audiencias and sentencias and all of that. So I'll tell you a little bit about the data, but we just couldn't do it at the time because the information wasn't out there. Okay, so you know, here's why the title. Well, this is from a demobilized paramilitary. He says he's talking about a community. A community is controlled by Fear or Dreams, okay, hence the title. The title is Fear and Dreams, and you'll see why it's Fear and Dreams when I get to the data. But he's saying fear or dreams. What do I mean, fear or dreams? It means if you want to control territory and control people, you can either scare them or you can be nice to them, okay? So you'll see that's not what the data suggests, but that's the motivating quote, okay? So what's really interesting about these paramilitary groups, as I said, there was 34 big blocks kind of divided into about 150 fronts. So within each big block, there were multiple fronts. And what we noticed back in 2011, 2012 was there was a huge amount of variation in the way these fronts operated. Okay? Some of them killed lots of people, all of them killed lots of people. But some of them built public goods, roads, schools, bull rings, houses for poor people, whatever. But lots of variation, not just in those things. There's lots of variation in how they were organized, whether they hired their relatives, how they taxed, all sorts of stuff, okay? But today, when you think about fear and dreams, you're going to think really about the variation in violence and the variation in public good provision, okay? And what we found really interesting about this, and that kind of motivates this approach, is that, you know, these paramilitary groups might have created institutions, but whatever explains the variation, it's not really accounted for by institutions. Now, when we think about, you know, comparative provision of public goods in the world, we ask ourselves, you know, how is that related to the form of the constitution or the electoral system or the party system or state institutions, how bureaucratized are state institutions? So we think about institutions as being the independent variable and, you know, public good provision as the dependent variable. But in this case, these paramilitary leaders, I think that's extremely clear from the case study evidence, they had a lot of discretion in deciding how to control territory. Okay, so then the question is, like, what decides whether you provide public goods or not? Who provides public goods and in what circumstances and why? And if it's a great idea, why doesn't everyone do it? Okay, so that's what this research is about. And, you know, just the big picture, I think everyone who works on comparative development sort of understands that there are these cases that are really difficult to explain. From an institutional perspective, I throw, you know, some of the names up here. You know, I've been working the last couple of years in Rwanda, which is a sort of fascinating case of a kind of autocracy, very personalized autocracy that's pushing development like crazy, you know. So I don't really understand what is pushing President Kagame to do what he does, but I don't think it's institutions in the usual way we think of them. Maybe there's informal institutions or other things going on there, but so that's the idea, okay? So first of all, I want to say something about, I'll say a lot more about Colombian paramilitarism. I'm never going to get through all the material, and I don't have a watch, so someone will just shut me up at some point. But let me just say, you know, like, it's good to think about the motivation, you know, of these paramilitary groups. And I think, like, what my understanding and all our research sort of suggests that, you know, the motivation of these groups was basically ideological, okay? They were anti-subversive, okay? So welcome to Puerto Boyacá, land of peace and progress. You know, you can take that with a pinch of salt if you like, or wait for the regressions. Anti-subversive capital of Colombia, okay? So their motivation was basically ideological, meaning they emerged in the 1970s. So if you read the paper is on my webpage. So you can read the paper. We have a lot about the history of these groups. So a lot of them had antecedent groups going back to the 1970s. They emerge in this enormous vacuum of authority known as kind of rural Colombia, where the state isn't present, the state doesn't do anything. And they're basically like local people who got guns and organized. I'll tell you a little bit about one group that we did a lot of field work with, where I know a lot about the history, okay? And here's, you know, Ernesto Baez, like alias Ernesto Baez, kind of one of the big kind of paramilitary commanders or entrepreneurs. You know, how could a small independent state work inside a lawful state such as ours? So the lawful state such as ours is the Colombian national state, and the little state is Autodefensas de Puerto Boyacá, okay? So they use that language all the time, okay? So I think, like, my own mind, you know, this paper, I think about this paper as being about state formation also, and you can think about that if you like, but every time I try to talk about that, you know, people say, what about sovereignty, you know? And so I don't want to talk about sovereignty. So Okay, so again, I want to emphasize these paramilitary, this ideological motivation. You're going to say, didn't they get involved in drug dealing? Sure. Sure, of course they did, okay? But I'm not going to show you the regressions with drug dealing, but what we show in the paper is they got involved in drug dealing, they got involved in fixing elections, they got involved in all sorts of things, but I don't think that's the primary motivation. So everyone gets involved in drug dealing in rural Colombia. That's the main sort of business. They needed to buy guns, they wanted to fund, they had to pay their soldiers. Of course, it's a nice source of money, okay? But I think what we show in the paper, I'm not going to try to talk too much about it because I'm not going to have time. What we try to show in detail in the paper is that's not confounding any of these results, and it's really unlikely to be driving anything I tell you about. Okay, so ideological, but there's huge variation in dreams and fears. Okay, so they had a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation. So what could be driving that variation? Okay, so when we started kind of mapping this variation, we were like, okay, what's a hypothesis about that? Okay, and so we were talking to Maria Teresa Ronderos, who's a very prominent Colombian journalist, about, what's driving that, and she said, I don't know, let's go talk to them. Okay, so it turned out these paramilitary commanders were appearing in court in Bogota, so you could just go, they were giving testimony, you could sit in the audience, and then it's lunchtime. So they're sitting there having their sandwiches, and then let's go talk to them. Let's go talk to them. So we spent a lot of time interviewing, I'll show you them later on in a minute, this one group of autodefensors from the Magdalena Medio. And after, I wouldn't say we got their trust, I think that would be a little too much, but after they decided we were not working for the Drug Enforcement Agency, they got it. They got this variation, and they started talking about it. And the way listening to them talk about what caused the variation is they all tell these stories of like socialization, childhood socialization. Oh, this guy, his father was a gangster. He grew up with guns, he has no principles. Of course, he went around killing people, and the word they used a lot was campesino. Okay, he's a campesino. He's a campesino. He got up 5 a.m., he milked the cows, he went to look after the coffee bushes. That's a guy with a good work ethic, solid, whatever. So we came up with the hypothesis, just talking to these people, that there's going to be a kind of systematic difference between campesino and non-campesino people. So what we've done is, so we have an enormous amount of information about the kind of background of the commanders of these fronts. The main hypothesis we're going to look at is we classify them into campesino, non-campesino. Of course, you might think, okay, these people are going to vary in lots of other ways, so I can try to control for that in terms of education, history, whether they were in the military, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so obviously I'm going to try to show that's not confounded by other things. The main hypothesis is that there's a significant difference between the way campesinos organize these fronts and non-campesinos, okay? So how do you think about that, okay? And the idea we got just from reading kind of also a lot of the qualitative work, so, if you're interested in Colombian paramilitarism, there's an enormous project that President Uribe started called the Grupo de Memoria Histórica, which at this point has 50 books on the webpage, and many of them are case studies of massacres or violence, but there's also now there's about 10 books just about different paramilitary groups. So just trying to read about, it's a particular perspective on paramilitarism from the side of the victims. So you don't hear the paramilitaries talking very much. It's mostly from the perspective of the victims. But what's interesting about that is this campesino thing also comes up in the qualitative information. And it seemed to us that there was really a different form of kind of social preferences here. So, and in particular, what campesinos sort of are is they have social preferences which are distinct, and we're going to conceptualize, in the paper we conceptualize that as being reciprocal preferences, okay? So they have, in a kind of behavioral sense, they have reciprocal preferences. What do I mean by reciprocal preferences? So here's a definition from Falcon Fischbacher. People are reciprocal if they reward kind actions and punish unkind ones, okay? So we have a model. I'm not going to talk about the model. I'll try to talk a little bit about no idea how much time I have. Okay, I'll try to talk a little bit about the intuition, not the algebra, and the main focus is going to be trying to think about, you think there's a paramilitary commander, the commander is trying to control territory, competing with the FARC, let's say. And you have a menu of options. You can provide public goods, people get utility from public goods, that leads people to support you rather than the FARC, but you can also try to terrorize people, okay? The main mechanism we try to focus on is this idea, captured by this, that in some sense, providing public goods, you provide public goods, but you expect people to support you or contribute to the mission, okay? How? Pay taxes, give information. That seems to be the main thing. You want to know where are the guerrilla. Remember these paramilitary groups, they're fighting against the FARC, they're fighting against the ELN, they're fighting against these communist guerrilla groups. So you want information. You want to know where are these people? Where are the groups? Where are they going? Where are their camps? And you want to make sure that people don't tell the FARC where your people are, where your troops are, how are you organizing? So we want, I think of contributions as kind of general, but the idea is I provide public goods in exchange for support, but if you don't support me or you don't contribute, I punish you with violence. Okay, so the model suggests the actual, if you think about the covariation, actually you should see public good provision and violence, because violence occurs to punish people who don't contribute. Okay, so in the model, there's two sorts of people. There's people with reciprocal preferences, there's people with non-reciprocal preferences. We look at a part of the parameter space where if you get public goods from a paramilitary commander, if you're a reciprocator, great, you get utility from reciprocating. If you're a non-reciprocator, you like the public goods, but you don't get utility from reciprocating, you deviate, and massacres, I'm going to talk about massacres, violence as massacres, kind of come as collective punishment for people who don't contribute to the project. Okay, so maybe that's just too much to talk about, okay? But I want you to think like this, where the road this led us is reciprocity kind of predicts this kind of positive covariance in some sense. You're going to see public good provision, but you're going to see violence, because violence is connected to punishing people who don't reciprocate, okay? All right, so I'm going to develop a model of that. I'm just going to kind of probably just repeat what I just said, so I'll go through that fast. The main thing about the data, which is cool, is just all this information we have from this transitional justice process. I'll give you some sense of that. And then the way we're going to approach this empirically is we're going to test the predictions of the model by exploiting boundaries between these different fronts. So as part of the transitional justice process, there's been this extremely detailed mapping of where all these fronts were. The data is really, of course, these groups started in the 1970s, many of them, but the data that we have, which is really good, is in some sense between 1997 and 2006, so this last period before they demobilized. So that's what we're going to focus on, and we're going to look at boundaries between between peasant commanders and non-peasant commanders. Okay, so I can talk a lot about the identification, all right? So what are the results? The results are campesino commanders are much more likely to provide public goods. They're much more likely to provide public goods. They provide more public goods, but they commit more violence, okay? And by violence, we're going to measure that by looking at massacres. A massacre is 4 or more people killed in the same place on the same day, okay? So I think there's an intellectual argument for looking at massacres, and there's a kind of pragmatic argument for looking at massacres. The intellectual argument I already gave you, which is that the model predicts there's sort of going to be this collective aspect of punishment, okay? The pragmatic reason for looking at massacres is, of course, there's far more assassinations. If you add up the number of people killed in massacres, it's about 30,000, but 200,000 people were assassinated in this period. So the problem with looking at assassinations is, first of all, you don't really know who assassinated anybody, and you don't really know where they were killed. So for our empirical strategy, what's nice about the information on massacres is that we kind of know who perpetrated the massacre. Typically, we know who perpetrated the massacre and where it was, okay? So that's very key for the approach. All right. So we don't see fear or dreams, we see fear and dreams. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to talk about the literature. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about Colombian paramilitarism. As I said, they start in the 1970s. In 1997, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia gets created by this Carlos Castaño, who's one of the great entrepreneurs of Colombian paramilitarism. Here's the AUC on his back. And that's really this period between 1997 and 2006 we're going to look at. Here's, just mapping blocks. You can see, over Colombia, different greens are, different blocks. I'll give you a better map of peasant, non-peasant commanders. But just to give you a sense, that this was sort of everywhere. These groups were kind of everywhere in Colombia, more or less in control. And some of these groups are kind of a bit complicated because they're not contiguous, meaning they had a particular core area and then they'd start an area somewhere else. Okay, but just to give you a sense of how important this is. And then in 2006, President Uribe, in a piece of kind of political genius, managed to get most of these people to demobilize. Not all of the fronts demobilized, but most of them demobilized. And I put this photograph with Don Berna. This is Don Berna here. You can see this gentleman here, who was like a big-time drug dealer and member of the kind of Oficina de Envigado. So he was a big-time drug dealer, just to kind of, remind myself that some of these people were real gangsters. This guy was a real gangster. Okay, all right. So, but there's a lot of variation in strategies, okay? So one of the things we did in the Magdalena Medio was we went to some of these places where in the court documents they talk about these public goods, and we just went to kind of check, is it true or not? So here's a school. This is in Sonson, in the municipality of Sonson in Antioquia. Here's a school built by paramilitaries. This is a road to San Francisco, a municipality that was built from the kind of autopista between Bogota and Medellin by paramilitaries. They went to Medellin, they stole a bunch of kind of equipment, road building equipment, like to build the road. This is a health clinic in Sonson that was built by paramilitaries. These are houses for poor people that were built also in Sonson. And in the paper we have the Plaza de Toros also, like the bread and circuses, so they built bull rings also. But there's this too. So this is not the same guys. This is a famous massacre in El Salado where over 60 people, 60-something people were murdered on one day in El Salado. Okay. So here's a paramilitary bloc. These are the guys that we talked to in Bogota. So this was a bloc. It was made up of 6 fronts. It was started in 1977 by this chap at the top, Ramon Izaza. Let me say also here, autodefensas campesinas. Okay, so peasant self-defense forces. Okay, so peasant comes up. He was called, nickname patron also, like patron. So kind of patron, patron, client, dependent relationships. Ramon Izaza. Here's the rest of the other fronts. On the right, this is the guy we got to know best, called Maguiva, alias Maguiva, is Frente José Luis Zuluaga. He's called Luis Eduardo Zuluaga. He was married to Izaza's daughter. The next 2 guys, Roque and Terror, are sons of Izaza. And then there's Gurre and Pájaro. So Gurre is like armadillo, So we asked him, like, why is he called armadillo? We asked Maguiva, and he said, he looks like an armadillo, don't you think? So these were the guys, like, we got the hypothesis from, basically, and just getting them to talk about. And, like, what's fascinating about this, like, one of the nicest regressions I'm going to show you has block fixed effects. So if we take out all the variation across the blocks and we just look at variation within the blocks, here's the variation within the blocks. Like, for example, Izaza and Maguiva provided loads of public goods. Terror, 0. Okay? So this is like really fascinating. These guys all got together on Sunday, and had lunch, in Puerto Triunfo. But they all adopted these like super different strategies. So for us, like, that was just like a really interesting social science question. Like, what the heck is going on there? Okay? So, all right. So I'm not going to talk about that. Okay? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So I talked about peasants and reciprocity. Okay, so you could, there's a large sociological literature, 1960s, 1970s, on peasants and peasant society, and, it was a kind of attempt to sort of create this different sort of non-Marxist sort of sociological concept to think about, you know, development and the problems of developing countries, you might think, what the heck has that got to do with reciprocity? Okay, so we can quote stuff from James Scott and Eric Wolf or whatever, but it turns out there's some real data on this from this political culture survey that Dane in Colombia did. So they collected information on kind of very standard questions about reciprocity, positive and negative reciprocity. So what we did is we took the micro data, we mapped it into the definition of campesino that, of course, they don't ask people, are you a campesino on this survey? But what we did is we know where people were living. We mapped it into the definition of campesino that we used, which is basically were born in a municipality which was at least 50% rural. So at least 50% of the population were living in rural areas. And so we can compare the answers to these questions, not campesino, non-campesino. And what you can see is campesinos are significantly more likely to return a favor, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this positive reciprocity index, negative reciprocity index. They're much more reciprocal on any kind of dimension than non-campesino. So there's at least a little bit of real evidence connecting campesino with reciprocity. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the model, you know, just to kind of give you a sort of flavor. Oh, I'm going to give you a flavor. I don't think I can give you a flavor. But you get, oops, what am I doing? I'm going in the wrong direction. Let me reverse. You know, just to go back to the idea, remember, there's two sorts of commanders. There's reciprocal commanders. There's people with reciprocal preferences where I give you something, you return the favor to me, I actually get utility from that. So just modeled as something that comes in your utility function. So a very standard model of reciprocity. And someone who's reciprocal offers public goods, a commander who's reciprocal offers public goods, and in exchange punishes people who are caught not cooperating. Okay? What if you're a non-reciprocal commander? Then basically, in the model, you can't credibly punish people. Punishing is costly. If I'm a reciprocator, I actually get utility from punishing you if you don't reciprocate. Okay? So we actually study a kind of very stark piece of the parameter space where commanders with reciprocal preferences provide public goods and they can credibly punish people who don't cooperate because they get utility from punishing. But a non-reciprocator doesn't get any utility from punishing people. They can't credibly punish, and so they don't provide public goods in the first place. Okay, so the model has it's only part of the parameter space, and don't ask me about repeated games and all that. Okay, so in the model, you know, it's not subgame perfect for it's not credible that a kind of non-reciprocator punishes. Okay, so in the model, the baseline model is just an assumption that campesinos are more likely to have these reciprocal preferences, and then we endogenize that through a kind of Bissin-Verdier type mechanism. So in the appendix, let me not get into that. Let me just say the predictions are, so some of it is sort of obvious, meaning, like the results are very close to the assumptions, my thesis advisor would have said, which was a devastating criticism. Meaning, we wrote the model down to kind of capture this, and so peasant commanders are more likely to provide public goods, peasant commanders more likely to commit massacres, okay? But here's the thing about the model. So there's two predictions of the model that I think are kind of surprising and we didn't really think about when we wrote it down. One is, it's not enough to show on average that peasant commanders are more likely to provide public goods or more likely to commit massacres. It has to be the same commander who's both providing public goods and doing the massacres, okay? That's the prediction of the model, so we can test that. So, and the second thing is, the model implies that campesinos are actually better at providing utility to people through this public good mechanism, because even the people who deviate actually benefit from the public goods. So in a reasonable extension of the model, fronts led by campesinos should last longer. Okay, they're contesting territory with their guerrilla. We can test, there's a prediction on duration we can test. Okay, so I think you might not get too excited. In Antioquia, you still have your preferences, and if you're a reciprocator, you're a reciprocator. Okay, so that's an interesting prediction, because when we first got into this, we sort of thought, okay, this is going to be about locals. Okay, surely, like if you're a local, you're operating in your own community where you grew up, you're going to be much more likely to be kind of public good minded, or you're going to empathize with people or something like that. Okay, but the model says that may be an independent mechanism, but we're kind of focusing much more on this. It doesn't matter whether you're a local or not, it matters like where you grew up and where you were socialized. Okay, so that's why I'm emphasizing. And, you know, it tells you a little about his life. You know, what was he doing? You know, he was a jornalero. You know, he worked with mules. He was a butcher, and he was an apostador de gallos. You know, like he bet on cocks. He went to betting on cockfights. Okay, so just to give you a kind of sense of the information, some of the information we use, you know, the information on public goods comes from the same sources, but like, you know, which we investigated, you know, with a lot of field work with the help of journalists. Staying on Cuco Van Ooy, what does it say about Cuco Van Ooy? Well, he built 2 clinics, okay? The Clínica Nueva Luz and the Clínica San Martín. And then in the sentence, it has a picture of one of the clinics, okay? So they document a lot of this public good provision actually in the court documents and the sentences, okay? Now, you might think, okay, of course he built a clinic. You know, he was fighting a war. His guys got shot and wounded, and they needed doctors. And yeah, that's true. That's part of the motivation. But what's interesting here is there's a lot of discussion on, yeah, okay, but then he opened it up to the entire community also. All right, what about violence? Well, you know, just to give you a sense, like, you know, there's a lot of information on massacres in Colombia that scholars have used. My colleague Andrila Dubé and Juan Fernando Vargas, I don't know if Juan Fernando is here, but you know, they have a paper using a lot of this data on violence at the municipal level. But of course, what we wanted to do was get down to a much more granular level, I can't say that word. Granular, no, I can't say it. All right. More micro level. So we actually went back to the sources and recoded everything at the vereda, below the municipality level. So here you see this is just from the Noche Niebla, which is this CINEPS publication. You can see, okay, in the vereda de Puerto Oriente, so the United Peasant Self-Defense Forces of the Eastern Plains made an incursion into the vereda of Puerto Oriente. So it mentions the sub-municipal level, and assassinated 11 people, lista en mano. So they had a list of people who they'd come to kill, and they massacred 11 people, but in that vereda. So we recoded all this information at the vereda level, lots of other data, et cetera, et cetera. You know, here is the map where we kind of boiled down, you know, campesino peasant commanders and non-peasant commanders. So the campesino commanders are in this horrible green color, and then the non-campesino are in gray, and then white is, you know, no paramilitary groups, or there's a lot of stuff we couldn't code. Okay, so the data set is less than all of the blocks and all of the fronts, because there's missing information. So at the time of the demobilization, some people just disappeared. You know, we don't have systematic information on them. People got killed. Some of the judges were much more diligent than others. So there's you know, so we end up with a kind of sample of about 72 fronts. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what this information looks like, so we have 37 campesino commanders and we have 35 non-campesinos. So we end up working with 72 fronts. You know, we collect all sorts of information, like were they locals, meaning was their front operating in a place where they were born? It's only about 14% of campesinos were locals. Actually, it's much lower than we thought it was going to be. 9% of non-campesinos were locals. Were they a victim of the guerrilla? Every non-campesino was a victim, meaning them or their family. Were they victimized? Were they kidnapped? Were they injured, you know, etc. by the guerrilla? So when you talk to these people, most of them got into paramilitarism because their relative was kidnapped, like Guy Magiva, his brother. The front was named after his brother, who was kidnapped and killed by the ELN. So that's a very common story. You can see it's very common. Okay, levels of education. Non-campesinos are much more educated. Okay, that's not, you know, you see that quite a lot of them were like former military people. Even some of them were kind of quite high society. Several of the very big paramilitary bosses were high society, kind of elite people who'd been to university. So campesinos are much less educated. So you might say, okay, there's a confounder, all right? So the way we're going to approach that is to sort of try to control for it. military experience. Non-campesinos are much more likely to have been in the army, much more likely to have been military officers. No campesinos had ever been a military officer. Criminal past, this is just, you know, had they ever been found guilty of some like crime, robbery, etc., carjacking, whatever. Drug dealing is, that's not the right terminology, but this is, had they been found guilty of like some crime associated with the drug industry in Colombia, okay? And just looking at the basic results here, you know, like on public goods, massacres, and front duration, you can see that, you know, fronts led by campesinos were much more likely to provide public goods than those non-campesinos. They're also much more likely to commit massacres. Remember, so massacre is 4 or more people killed. They're much more likely to commit massacres, but also they have longer duration, okay? So actually you can see from the descriptive statistics the main kind of results here, which is campesinos provide more public goods, but they're more violent and the fronts last longer. Okay, so let me tell a little bit. How long do I have to go? Okay, great. So let me talk a little bit about identification. You know, so the empirical strategy is, I gave you a sense of some of the data. We have lots of other stuff too, and I can show you some balance. But like, what's the main empirical challenge? You know, we're going to look at, you know, so this is just a sort of canonical regression discontinuity design. You know, peasant F is just a dummy variable, which is 1 if the front F was had a campesino commander. The left-hand side is going to be, you know, a dummy variable for did they provide public goods. We could look at the count variable, the number of public goods. We can also look at different sorts of public goods, so we look at that data in different ways. Or it's going to be, you know, massacres, basically. Again, we can look at whether there was a massacre. We can look at the total number of massacres, etc. So there's a lot of robustness. I'll just show you some simple things here. But I want to talk a little bit about identification, meaning, you know, what's the main kind of identifying assumption here? It's that, you know, there may be lots of unobservables here, but they're varying smoothly at the boundary. Okay, what's jumping at the boundary is on this side of the boundary we have a campesino paramilitary commander. On the other side we don't. Okay, so for that to identify, for this regression, for gamma to identify the causal effect, it has to be that any other observables are kind of varying smoothly at the boundary. Okay, now obviously it's not random whether or not you get a campesino commander. Okay, so what we did, our approach to that is we did several approaches, but I think here's the most plausible one. What the court testimonies have and the sentencias is they have amazing amount of information about the history of these people. Okay, meaning how did they become a paramilitary? What did they do in the paramilitary? What was their kind of career path? And what were they doing when they became promoted to comandante? And like, why did they get promoted to comandante? Okay, and I think thinking about it econometrically, kind of what you're concerned about is there some unobservable at the kind of the level of this front, which is kind of correlated with whether or not you get a campesino commander, but also associated with the attractiveness of providing public goods or the effectiveness of committing massacres. And that could be something that's jumping at the boundary. Okay? But what's fascinating when you look at the testimonies or the histories of how these people get into paramilitarism is that there's barely any discussion of that. So the reason people become commanders basically is how are they getting promoted? Okay? The block commander essentially chooses. So I showed you that block, Ramon y Saza. How did those people become commanders of those fronts? Ramon y Saza chose them. Okay? Who did he choose? His 2 sons, his son-in-law. There's other 2 guys. Gurre. How did he choose Gurre? Gurre was his bodyguard. Okay? He got a job. He was a kind of hoodlum. He hired him. He was his bodyguard. He trusted him. Same with Pájaro. Okay? So the main reason people get promoted is their relatives, their friends, they grew up together, they're trusted, they have experience in the group, which develops trust. And so I think our reading of the qualitative information is it's really hard to read that to think that the identification is sort of messed up by some unobservable at the level of the front, kind of correlated with these variables in the way, you know, that would create bias in that coefficient. Okay? I'm going to show you balance, you know, the usual thing. I'm going to show you more. I'm going to show you balance at the kind of at the boundary, but you might also think, but hold on a second, like, why do I care about the boundary? You know, the commander is like in charge of this whole front, so I don't care just about the boundary. So what we do in the appendix is we show balance actually at the whole front level also. You know, maybe it's something at the front level, so we kind of do different sorts of balance. But I think, like, for me, it's all in the appendix. If you get really excited about this, you know, we discuss a lot in the appendix about the history of how these people became commanders. I think if you read that, it's very hard to kind of tell a story about bias in this coefficient. So anyway, that's, and you know, and okay, that's my pitch. Okay, all right. Okay, I talked about that. All right, so balance, you know, let me not talk about geography. Let me talk about other things. So I think, you know, so we look at a lot of kind of covariates on either side of the boundary. You know, you could think of a lot of things you might be worried about, okay? So campesinos are better at defeating the guerrilla in our model. They're better at controlling territory, okay? So maybe some sort of territory is more valuable, okay? Or the guerrilla are like really powerful, so I really need to get somebody good at controlling territory, you know. So I think that's, we can tell stories about that. Or, you know, or there could be a massive dearth of public goods. I mean, there's a dearth of public goods everywhere in rural Colombia, in my experience, but maybe some places are really, really, really bad. So then the marginal utility of public good provision could be really high. So if you have a campesino who's going to deliver public goods, that's going to be very effective at controlling that place, okay? So what we try to do is just measure stuff, public goods, you know, try to show there's balance, you know. This is just running that regression discontinuity model, and now we put these things on the left-hand side, different measures of local public goods, show balance, presence of the guerrilla. So this is just, again, sort of pre-treatment, you know, presence of the guerrilla, again, from this kind of CINEP, this Noche Niebla and these other databases. So we don't find much difference in previous paramilitary, but this is the one I was kind of more interested in. Coca suitability, oil pipelines. Again, you might think more valuable. Let's put someone in charge who knows what they can really kind of control territory. What do you want to control? Well, places where you can grow coca, okay? We don't find that. If anything, you know, it has a negative coefficient, okay? Oil pipelines, a big source of income is basically Ecopetrol. The Colombian oil company has all these pipelines. So a big source of income is basically smashing the pipeline, stealing it, and then selling it on the black market. So that we don't see anything like that, okay? So we could look at all sorts of other things. You know, I don't want to go through it. You know, so social capital, civic. You know, this is the Juntas de Acción. We could look at politics, you know, land disputes, etc. Okay, I just wanted to kind of talk about a few things, you know. So there's a lot of discussion of balance, both on the boundary, which is what I'm talking about there, but also at the whole front level. And I can also, this is a little bit naughty. You know, why is it naughty? Well, it's post-treatment. So this is the survey I showed you data from earlier about how campesinos are more kind of reciprocal. So we could sort of narrow in on the boundary and sort of look at, you know, are there differences in social preferences? You know, meaning, you know, okay, you showed me some covariates, but what about reciprocity? You know, maybe in a community where there's more people that are reciprocal, you want to put a campesino in charge. Well, I can't measure that before 1997, but for what it's worth, you don't see anything, okay? So it's balanced on that, all right? Meaning it seems to be balanced on reciprocity, kind of. This is not just looking at campesinos, this is like just looking at the community, okay? You don't seem to see differences, but again, you know, again, this is like post-treatment, so you could take that with a pinch of salt, although it's a pinch of salt that would be very difficult to turn into a story that generates bias. That's my claim. Okay, fine. All right, commander selection, blah, blah, blah. You know, this is, I already talked about that, so let me show you some regressions. Okay, so let me show you some regressions before we run out of time. 8 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, so as I said, you know, we can sort of measure these things in different ways. Let me just show you something simple with, you know, public good equals 1. You know, so we played around with the coding of this, meaning, remember, the unit of observation here is going to be a kind of vereda. So imagine I build that health clinic in a particular vereda. Then that's not just generating benefits for people in that vereda. Actually, there's people from all around who are coming to that health clinic, okay? So if I just assign the public goods to the vereda, everything works, but it seemed to us more reasonable to kind of, if there's a public good provided in that particular vereda, we give like 1 to like everything in the municipality, because that's kind of where the benefits are being generated. Okay, so it's robust to playing with that, but just to be kind of clear, massacre, that's just in the vereda, and then, you know, we can look at duration, as I said, the duration of the front, okay? So here's the sort of the basic model, regression discontinuity, lots of different ways of, you know, modeling the running variable. I'm not going to go into that in detail, just to kind of show you quantitatively this is very important. So if you look at the coefficient, it's very robust. 0.9, you know, it's about 150% of the mean. Okay, so it's quantitatively, it's a very big increase in, you know, you can think of this as just the probability that a public good is going to get provided. And here, you know, number 6, column 6 is the specification I like a lot, where you put these block fixed effects in. So you take out the cross-block variation, you just look at the variation within the block, and, you know, the coefficient goes down. It's not so, you know, but it's still there, you know, and that's, I find that there's a lot of idiosyncratic variation. And it's not just being driven by the block commanders, which you might imagine. Okay, so here's the pictures. What about massacres? So again, now the left-hand side variable is massacre, this dummy variable. And you can see here campesinos are much more likely to commit massacres than non-campesinos. Okay, and again, you see it's about the size of the mean, all right? So it's a very big effect, kind of quantitatively. Now, here, yeah, okay, whatever. Here's the duration results. Again, this again is pretty big quantitatively. You can see that, you know, the average duration is about 5.5 years here, and the size of the coefficient is about 1.5. Okay, so it's very big. I should say, in the model, there's 2 aspects of this. There's kind of entry and exit, but if you remember my kind of discussion at the start, the exit is sort of truncated because most of these groups are demobilizing in 2006. So actually this result is all driven by entry, by some groups entering earlier than others, okay, the duration result. Now I wanted to talk about this, which is to say, okay, but maybe Campesino is being confounded by something else. I showed you that they're less educated, you know, maybe they're more likely to be locals, maybe that's what's driving it, okay? So here's the public good regression where we just kind of control for these different characteristics of these paramilitary commanders. And what's interesting about this is, yeah, that the local effect is there, actually. Locals are much more likely to provide public goods. And it's quantitatively much larger, in fact, but it doesn't do it. It's kind of orthogonal to the peasant effect. Okay, so my colleague Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, for example, some of you may know this paper he has on like stationary bandits in the eastern Congo. He finds all the results like are basically driven by locals. So what types of stationary bandits, when they kind of become more state-like, actually improve welfare in the communities or provide public goods? It's only the locals, okay? So what we find is the locals here, there's definitely something happening, but it's not, it's sort of orthogonal to peasant, okay? So, you know, what else do you find? Well, you know, people with military experience seem to be more likely to provide public goods. Education doesn't really do anything. You might have worried that the campesinos, you know, they're less educated. I don't know how that would go. You know, they're less educated. Maybe you think they provide fewer public goods. I don't know. Anyway, so, and, you know, here's what happens, you know, when you look at massacres. It turns out that locals are not less likely to massacre less. It's negative, but the coefficient is negative, but it's not significant. And what's interesting about this is, let me go back to this, which is, go back to drug dealing. You know, like everyone who, you know, who studies Colombia thinks that like drug dealing is the kind of master variable. You know, you mentioned that paper. One of the points I make in that paper is that drug dealing is like a symptom of Colombia's problems. It's not the cause of Colombia's problems. Of course, you've seen El Patrón del Mal. If you haven't seen it, you should watch that. It's like amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's much better than reading my paper. It will take you longer to watch it than to read my paper, but it's really good. Anyway, you know, Pablo Escobar, he built sports stadiums and houses for poor people, blah, blah, blah. Big picture, we actually find a history of drug dealing, people with a history of drug dealing are less likely to provide public goods, okay? And they're more likely to massacre people, okay? So the glamorous legacy of Pablo Escobar is not confirmed by these results, all right? But really, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but I really just wanted to kind of say, the main point here is the main effect that we're kind of emphasizing. A lot of this stuff is of independent interest, but the main effect we're emphasizing seems to be robust to that, and people who, Leopoldo will, recognize this result. People who are former military officers are much more likely to commit massacres in Colombia. All right, and then this is the result, which is cool, which is just showing, this is not a causal regression, this is just showing there's this correlation between, the same paramilitaries that provide the public goods commit the massacres. Okay, all right, conclusions. So, kind of big picture, backing away from the Colombian case, how did we, which is fascinating, of course, but like, I think why we think this is interesting is there is this work showing that individuals matter. There's this great paper by Jones and Olkin sort of showing that, when you have exogenous leader deaths in countries, you get these changes in growth transitions, could be up, could be down. There's work by Antoinette Shaw and Marianne Bertrand about like CEOs, how there's sort of some individual characteristics of CEOs that make companies more successful or less successful. What is it about those CEOs? Well, they went to business school, or, they're old, or like, so I think there's some evidence about this kind of role of individuals in different parts of the profession and different kind of literatures, but we don't really have a handle so much on like what's the connection between the individual's personality or their socialization or their history that leads them to take particular actions. So I think we hope, here, I don't want to say Paul Kagame is doing what he's doing because he has reciprocal preferences, although it might be true, actually. But we hope that this kind of backing away from the specificities of the Colombian context, there's some kind of more interesting general point here about, we have a lot to learn about people's motivations and people's projects and ideas, and institutions are great, but individuals are also important in a way in this context that seems extremely significant. At least that's what the results suggest. So, thank you.
We are on time. I don't know, do we have 5 minutes for questions? Okay, then perhaps we can have a couple of questions. And I say a couple in the Spanish sense of the word and only 2. But,
Okay.
Professor, thank you for coming, and thank you for giving us this far corner of the world the opportunity to hear you in person. Fascinating, but more broad question about receding institutions and how Western world is backing away from institutions. We see it in America, we see it in Europe, we see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Is there somewhere that we can look for hope in the world, or where do you look for hope in the world, in a nation that it's actually going the right way in terms of strengthening institutions? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I think that if you thought about like our work, the early work that Daron and I did about sort of democratization and stuff, our first book, we focused very much on these kind of elite challenges to institutions. I think what we see now much more is there's popular challenges to institutions too. After all, Venezuelan citizens, in their wisdom, voted Hugo Chavez into power, who then kind of destroyed the state in Venezuela. Mexicans, López Obrador, his kind of dismantling institutions in Mexico, he's wildly popular. So I think we underestimated, or we didn't really conceptualize all these other mechanisms, that in terms of what makes institutions stable and what makes institutions equilibria. And I think there's a lot of exciting research. It's a little bit nerve-wracking to be living through it, but there's a lot of exciting research on that question, it seems to me. And I think, like, if I look at what just happened in the United States, I think its institutions are kind of malfunctioning, basically. I think, in Latin America, there's this wave of democratization, the third wave of democratization, that comes in the 1980s, in the Southern Cone, the 1990s, Central America. Everyone is promised the earth. They think democracy is going to come and it's going to transform their lives and it's going to change everything. And democracy turns out to be clientelistic and corrupt, and it doesn't transform people's lives. And I think we all underestimated the difficulty of actually constructing functioning democratic institutions that redistribute, that create, a difference, And I think, in some sense, that's what's happening in the United States for different reasons. most people in the United States, there's been some growth in wages in the last few years, but the big picture is most Americans, are no better off than they were 50 years ago, People without a college degree, their wages have stagnated for 50 years. For 50 years, employment opportunities disappeared. You have the whole China shock. Political elites are completely out to lunch, for me. Like the Democrats, I'm not a Trump supporter, but how can it make any sense whatsoever to prioritize forgiving college loans? People with college education, they're the winners. They're part of the winners in the last 50 years in the United States. And the Democrats prioritize forgiving student debt. Like, so that's sort of baffling. They're completely out of touch with working class Americans, it seems to me. And so people are unhappy, and when you're unhappy, you look for solutions, and I think President Trump provides solutions. The solutions have nothing whatsoever to do with the problems, like maybe partially China, maybe, but it's obvious that immigration has nothing whatsoever to do with the problems in the United States, So I think for me it's a challenge to the institutions, like, John Betjeman. So John Betjeman, the former British poet laureate, wrote a very funny poem during the Second World War called Westminster Abbey. And he says, our country stands for democracy and good drains, And so democracy has to provide good drains, in order for people to believe in it. Like, maybe people intrinsically believe in it, or you care about the mechanism and the process. Yeah, okay, but we want good drains too. And that's a failure of the institutions. And I found, like, when Biden came to power, I thought, great, there's going to be so much discussion now of, like, revitalizing democracy, and nothing. Like zero, like nothing whatsoever. No, so I that's I don't know. So it's a long conversation. I don't have a good answer. The good news is, there's a lot of things we don't understand in kind of political economy. It seems like it's a very exciting moment to be a young person interested in political economy.
I was asked to make an announcement about something I don't know. Then for me it will be a surprise. Let me see how I have to escape from here. I have to come here. Suspense. ¿Es esta aquí? ¿Esta aquí? ¿Esta aquí? Qué globito. Vení porque no... Acá. Vení, subí. Yo uso más. Acá me pierdo. El globito. Ah.
No,
¿No?
not this one.
Lo pusiste por ahí arriba, ¿no?
Ahí
Es
arriba.
esa cosa. Okay. Okay, I'm watching like you. Then it's the announcement of the next year Lasea Lames meeting. It will take place in Recife, Brazil, on November 2022. Then you are welcome.
Okay, how's that? Okay.
No,
los